I've only got 12 minutes, and I just want to sort of get through, and I think it'll follow on quite nicely from what you were saying, Kyle. So yes, I'm Kristine Landon-Smith, born to an Australian father and Indian mother. I was brought up in Australia, but spent most of my professional life in the UK. And I thought the most useful thing for me to do today was simply talk through the journey of my organisation, Tamasha, with an emphasis on our interventions into audience activation. Now, I'll be using the language and terms that are accepted norms in the UK, and surely they're going to be very different from the terms you use here. So, for example, when I'm using the term Asian, I mean of Indian or Pakistani descent. And this is going to come up quite a lot in the presentation. And I am speaking only about the context within which I operate, which is the UK landscape. And clearly it's very different here from what I've already been gathering. So for me, audience activation is about equality and representation. In the UK, the Arts Council states that 93% of the cultural workforce is white, with currently only one theatre building being black-led. The overwhelming majority of BAMA artists, and that's what I am, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, Refugee, this is the label we have, work in minority-led companies which the mainstream institutions occasionally flirt with. Mainstream institutions by default can't represent the range and diversity of voices in BAMA communities, and they often overlook or simply cannot see the value of work that some BAMA artists propose. This is my experience. The tension between artists from BAMA backgrounds seeking regular spaces to show their work and the resistance from the mainstream to regularly programme the work is one factor, in my opinion, that contributes to the sad fact that in 2012 our theatres are still pretty monocultural, both in terms of the people on stage and the people watching the work. So my company, Tamasha, was set up in 1989 to bring stories of the Asian diaspora to the British stage. We've since evolved into an organisation which puts the multiple narratives and global perspectives of Britain's evolving culture and audiences at its heart. So my business partner, Sudha Bhuchar, and myself were driven to set up our company when we saw there was very little on our British stages telling stories with contemporary theatre practice about contemporary life of Asian communities around the world. Our first production, Untouchable, was an adaptation of a book by the same name by Mukraj Anand, and told the story of a latrine sweeper in 1930s India and drew parallels with street life in India today. It drew huge audiences from mainly Indian communities to the Riverside Theatre in Hammersmith, and from our early days our company had a momentum of its own, and this was partly due to our ability to attract these audiences. We were quickly approached by various producing houses wanting to develop their own audiences, and in particular by venues that had a large Asian constituency on their doorstep that they wanted to attract. The early reputation we built for ourselves was a double-edged sword. We were thrilled to bring audiences to venues for the first time, but as artists, to also have the label audience developer attached had its own problems, which I'll talk about later in more detail. How did we bring audiences to the theatre? We provided product which spoke very, very directly to particular groups of people, and they came in their droves. We were making work in our minds for all audiences, but clearly the particular nature of the work attracted niche audiences. And the niche were hungry for stories about themselves. And it really was quite thrilling in the way Kyle described, because I really remember all these new communities coming to the theatre, seeing their lives represented in London, on the stage, and elsewhere for the first time, and literally they could not believe what they were seeing. In a building like this, they just couldn't believe that their lives were there up in front of them. And these communities were very, very specific and distinct from each other. For example, the Hindu Sindhi community in House of the Sun, the Birmingham Muslim Punjabi community in Balti Kings, the Gujarati community in North London in Strictly Dandia. So much of our work has been made through a very tangible and deep engagement with these particular communities, and this early engagement with groups of people meant that a growing curiosity and sense of ownership was felt by the communities that ultimately became our audiences. We were sensitive around representation, nothing was censored, but we earned trust and had advocacy, which was helpful when we were showing new communities on stage for the first time with their successes and failures alike. We also resisted the pressure to simplify content for non-Asian audiences. And as you can imagine, this took a long time, and building the advocacy and the audiences was through labour-intensive, regular and very, very close engagement. And what also became very attractive to some of our co-producing partners was that our audiences demonstrated very different behaviours, patterns of behaviour to other theatre goers. They would normally buy the highest priced tickets. They would think nothing of travelling 12 to 15 miles to the theatre to come and see the work, which directly reflected their own experience, and they would often come in parties of 10 or more. With the creation of a particular product, which brought particular audiences, also came the growth of a whole new community of artists. House of the Sun marked the first job for Nina Wadia, Archie Punjabi and Sunetra Sarkar, and each one of these actresses have gone on to have phenomenal and very visible careers. And these actresses very quickly became role models for others who were thinking of broaching the subject of a career in entertainment with their parents. It's been so interesting to see over the past 21 years that once you start offering a particular product, which draws a particular audience, the whole ecology does start to change because each part of the venture is so inextricably linked. A very good example of this is East is East, an early and very visible production of ours. This was described by Chris Smith, the Culture Secretary at the time, as the first crossover of culturally diverse work into the mainstream. And Ayub Khan Din, who was the scriptwriter of the stage play, went on to write the screenplay for East is East and has now written the screenplay for Rafta Rafta and West is West, changing the face of the mainstream cinema audiences and bringing in the brown pound. Now, I just want to concentrate briefly on our work, Strictly Dandia, to raise a few other provocations around audience activation. So Strictly Dandia was a dance musical set in the Gujarati community of North London. Each year the Gujarati community held a dance festival called Navratri, literally meaning nine, Nav, night, Rat, of dancing. Its origins are religious, but now it's a sort of matchmaking event for families of the same caste. Hugely successful. We remounted it 3 times and it did over 90% box office in the Lyric Theatre in London and on a national tour. However, Strictly Dandia for me encapsulated the difficulties as well around work of this nature. It was very particular, very curious. Navaratri is not known to most non-Asian people and the Gujarati community is very distinct. We felt the story was universal, girl meets boy, wrong match, dance competition, all comes right in the end. However, the critics, who are part of the web, in my opinion, of gatekeepers, they expressed confusion. They were sitting in an audience where laughter erupted early on at small nuances they didn't understand. The actors were using Gujarati accents which may have taken 5 minutes or so for the ear to attune to. And the joy of the Gujarati audience upset them rather than thrilled the white critics. And the message that came from some of the critics was this. This was a review we got at the Edinburgh Festival. A jolly entertainment of hot moves and Gujarati grooves was always going to be the odd one out in a weighty lineup that included Hamlet and the Seagull. So our analysis of this type of review is this. We think the suggestion being made from the gatekeepers is this is theatre made by a particular community and for a particular community. So in our minds, this could be viewed as community theatre. And inherent in that, I think, is, can this therefore be part of the theatre community? So we made the work for everyone. Our partners at the Lyric, who we had long had an association with, were empathetic and sold it widely. And my feeling was that early reviews separated the audiences, warning some of them, it's not for the likes of you. Manchester Online Review said, it is strictly for the culturally attuned. I know, it's so depressing. So whilst we did tremendous business, the makeup of our audience was largely Gujarati. And in terms of artistic critique, the ethnicity seemed to act as a screen or block to critics being able to employ the same standards and benchmarks that they normally do when reviewing work. There is no doubt that we are burdened with the responsibility of being one of the few Asian companies around, and therefore it often feels like we are expected to be the spokesperson for every issue within the Asian community that the wider public is curious about. So Strictly Dandia was a surprise, and the subject was not something that the critics had thought an Asian company in 203 might choose to deal with in theatrical representation, nor should we deal with it, as a matter of fact. I think that they were saying that. And with that burden of representation, our comedy verbatim show, The Trouble with Asian Men, in 2007, just after the appalling suicide bombings in London, led one critic to say this. The main trouble with Asian men, you might think, is that a few of them currently want to blow us up. Yeah, I know. And don't give a damn if they blow themselves up too. Yet radical, murderous Islam barely gets a look in during this entertaining, revealing, but worryingly soft, focused piece of verbatim theatre. There is nothing here from supporters of Al-Qaeda, from extreme mullahs, or a dangerously disaffected youth. In other words, the Asian men who are causing all the trouble have been cravingly avoided. Yeah, I know. You can imagine how we felt. One of the big questions is, can we achieve mixed audiences, and how do we do it, and do we want to do it? I'm not one for separate experiences for separate people, but certainly I rarely in the theatre see sufficiently mixed audiences. In our case, our audiences are very show-specific, with a whole range of factors contributing to the particular makeup for each show. With our more country-specific work, we do attract much larger niche audiences than mixed audiences. In the mainstream, it is rare to experience mixed audiences for a traditional season. If a more diverse range of product was available year-round in our producing houses, I wonder if new audiences returning for the third or fourth time might then choose to see anything because a loyalty factor has been built up. But product that is diverse and captures the imagination of different groups of people because it speaks directly to them and reflects their lives back to them must be there in the first place on a regular basis. And if you suspect that your target audiences are first-time theatre goers, you need to go and get them. So 21 years on from my company's inception, I feel we have contributed to the growth of a whole community of artists who would not find a regular place to work if it was not for companies like us and others. And we have contributed to, and therefore changed in some way, the face of the mainstream. However, challenges remain, slightly different, but they are still there. As an arts organisation of the 21st century, we are now looking at a whole range of ways in which to open up pathways to new and growing audiences. We're starting to tell stories online, developing photographic and video galleries, and we're in the very early stages of tracking responses to try and understand better the behaviour of our larger audiences who do not necessarily need to come to the theatre to understand the work of the company. And I'm hoping that this broader dissemination of our work that is more in our control will ultimately stimulate at a faster pace interventions of audience activation in the mainstream.